I'm Christopher Clark, Cambridge historian. I was born in Australia. For Europeans, that's practically the other end of the world. But the European continent and its incredible diversity always fascinated me. Even in the far-off country where I grew up, I was always aware that so much of our world has its roots in Europe. And modern Europe is one of the greatest achievements in human history. I want to share the grand saga of this continent, and in the process, I hope to rediscover its wonders for myself. Where does Europe start and where does it stop? I'm at the southwesternmost point of the continent. From here on, there's just water. Next stop, America. Luís de Camões, the national poet of Portugal, described this cape in the 16th century in these words: "Aqui onde a terra se acaba e o mar começa," where the earth ends and the ocean begins. In fact, most of Europe is surrounded by water. Europe is a continent in name only. In reality, it's a peninsula, and its history is deeply shaped by this fact. That history begins 135 million years ago. Actually, Europe as we know it isn't really all that old in a geological sense. In the beginning, all the continents are one. Then the world is set in motion. Land masses break off, drift apart, and reunite, creating mountains and rivers in the process. Bit by bit, the continent as we know it today begins to take shape. Ice masses form fjords, mountains unfold. The lava flows we can still see today give us an inkling of Earth's incredible power to create and reshape. And at some point, these elementary forces will produce a denser array of unique cultures and peoples than anywhere else on the planet. How did it all begin? Asia, to which this rather small continent is a kind of appendix, has always been the gateway to Europe, also for the first humans to arrive here. But who were the first Europeans, and where were they from? It's during an ice age that the first people leave Africa to conquer the rest of the world. A sheet of ice kilometers thick covers the continent where today we find cities like London, Berlin, and Warsaw. But Homo sapiens will not be deterred. From what we know today, it seems that they traveled to the continent via the Middle East, the Levant, and Romania, and slowly it begins to grow warmer in Europe. The Ice Age is coming to an end. This is where the first migrants come into contact with the Neanderthals and begin to mix with them. Even today, all Europeans have a bit of Neanderthal in them. By 30,000 years ago, the Neanderthals have died out, and the Homo sapiens, the wise human, has taken over. They hunt and gather, live in groups of varying sizes, and spread out across massive swathes of territory, often in rocky areas with caves, such as southern France and northern Spain. It's around this time that the intellectual world of the early Europeans actually begins to take shape. The depths of the caves are sacred places for these early peoples, prehistoric cathedrals where they feel the presence of the supernatural world. But above all, the caves offer protection and warmth, absolute necessities that allow these early Europeans to survive. Here we can see the first evidence of the ancient Europeans. I'm in the Chauvet cave in southern France, and I can hardly believe that people painted something like this 30,000 years ago. The talent and precision of these early European artists are staggering. When Pablo Picasso first saw the cave paintings of Stone Age humans, he was shocked. "We've learned nothing since then," he said. The people of the Ardèche Valley in modern-day France created these first European works of art nearly 40,000 years ago, and they did it for eternity, probably without realizing it. How could they know that we would one day admire the woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, mammoths, and bison that they drew with such energy and elegance? A quantum leap in human history. Homo sapiens became a cultural being. Humans reflected on their own existence, observed and recorded their environment, and invented a new form of communication. A bison with 8 legs, like a time-lapse image. We can't know for sure, but they were probably supposed to suggest movement, a kind of Stone Age cinema. These works are among the oldest expressions of human creativity anywhere on Earth, a kind of cultural Big Bang. We have no idea what brought it about. All human societies have produced art, and there have always been moments in which something new emerged. What was special about Europe was the tension between memory and renewal, between continuity and rupture. Michelangelo may have imitated the Greeks, but he also created something new, something that had never been seen. Landscapes, objects, and people came to be seen in new ways. Art rebelled against tradition without escaping from its authority. Images and objects from Asia and Africa enriched the visual repertoire. Boundaries were tested and breached. Freed from the obligation to depict anything real, paintings took on a life of their own. And these astonishing moments of creativity would have been unthinkable without the diversity of the cultures on this continent and the cultural competition between them. It would be difficult to underestimate the spiritual effect these caves had on the people of that era. We're now fairly certain that some caves were used specifically for rituals. Humans already lived in groups at this point, and they divided up their work among themselves. It's easy to imagine that during the winter, when the opportunities for hunting and gathering were limited, they would have honed their cultural skills. And that's how we get the Lion Man, carved from a mammoth tusk 35,000 years ago. Half man, half lion, perhaps even a demigod. It began in caves, but soon spread into the world beyond. The first outdoor venues of collective worship sprang up in multiple locations across Europe around 5,000 years ago. The first settled peoples positioned enormous boulders in circles, creating sites like Stonehenge. They were aligned with the course of the sun and primarily served as observatories. Transporting and setting up the stones must have been an incredibly challenging task for the people of that era. They had to be highly organized and must have developed specialized skills and technologies for the job. Ancestor worship played an important role here. They wanted to immortalize the world of their forebears in stone for all eternity. Cults and strictly defined rituals seem to have been the glue that held these early societies together. Of course, we need to see this in perspective. While the Europeans were positioning boulders, the Egyptians were building pyramids. Stone monuments sprang up from Spain to Sweden and Poland to France. For the first time, these megaliths mark a visible commonality among the various peoples of Europe. But at the same time, the first cities are already appearing in modern-day Iraq and Syria. Europe is still a developing country. In the Eastern Mediterranean, on the other hand, things are starting to get interesting. Myths and legends are being woven. Why is Europe called Europe? Well, the answer lies here in Greece. A myth relates that Zeus, father of the gods, fell in love with beautiful Europa, daughter of the Phoenician king of Sidon in today's Lebanon. Europa immediately fell in love with the bull, or rather Zeus, and climbed onto his back. Together they swam to Crete. There the bull took human form and asked the beautiful maiden to be his queen. The part of the world where she lived would forever bear her name. It's a myth, of course, but like all myths, it contains a kernel of truth, because the origins of Europe really did lie outside this continent, in Asia Minor, the Levant, and Africa. From the very beginning, Europe was a place where cultures met and mixed, and this would be one of the keys to its power and creativity. It all started on Crete. The islanders were gifted seafarers and traders. Crete became Europe's first commercial power, crafting an impressive trade network that stretched across the entire Mediterranean to Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Cretans grew olives and exported the valuable oil to places like Egypt. King Minos, who according to legend was the son of Zeus and Europa, commissioned the construction of a magnificent palace in Knossos over 3,000 years ago. Today it still bears witness to the golden age of both the island and the Minoans, the first advanced civilization in Europe. Europe's first kingdom emerges here, but there are many indications that the Minoans aren't particularly interested in personally exercising power. From everything we know about this mysterious culture, it appears that leaders and heroes didn't play an especially eminent role. The first European laws and courts have their roots in Minoan society. Their legal codes governed everything from family law to criminal law, literally letter by letter. The Minoans were the first Europeans who could read and write. They adopted their writing system from the Phoenicians. This Middle Eastern alphabet is the mother of all European writing systems. The Minoans even stamped these symbols in clay on the famous Phaistos disc nearly 3,000 years before Johannes Gutenberg invented modern printing. The meaning of the ancient symbols may have been forgotten over time, but the Greeks ultimately based their own alphabet on the Minoan writing system, and both our Latin alphabet and the Cyrillic Eastern European alphabet have their origins in Greek. For centuries to come, Europe's path would be shaped by the legacy of ancient Greece. What was so special about Greece? Well, partly it was a question of geography. The Greeks were scattered in some 1,500 cities, the poleis, around the shores of the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The terrain of the Greek mainland, crisscrossed by mountains and ravines, favored small communities, but also obliged them to trade and negotiate with each other. Not all of the cities were democracies. Some were ruled by oligarchs or by tyrants. But one city established a system of government that would leave a deep imprint on world history. Nothing compares to Athens in its golden age. Many of the traits that define modern Europe can be found here. The Greeks' world consists of numerous gods to whom they dedicate the temples they build, but also of brilliant thinkers who spend their days investigating earthly concerns. The grand Parthenon temple on the Acropolis is the most beautiful representation of what the streets and squares of ancient Athens brought forth into the world: architecture, science, philosophy, art, literature, and also political thought. Athens isn't ruled by a king, but by the people. For the first time in the continent's history, all men share responsibility for the decisions that affect everyone. Women don't yet play a political role, but it's a start. Democracy is born.
Calm down! All opposed to the proposal, raise your hands. And all in favor, raise your hand now.
Perhaps we could learn a thing or two from the ancient Athenians. They used a voting machine known as a kleroterion to fill political offices. Men were elected by lottery, so there was no opportunity for corruption or for lobbying.
Leonidas Linos, you are elected.
But all of this didn't happen overnight. Democracy in Athens developed slowly, step by step, and it was repeatedly reformed. The Athenian democracy possessed three institutions that remain crucial to the political organization of any free society: a basic law or constitution dating back to the 5th century BC, a parliament, the ecclesia, where matters of state were discussed by the citizenry, and a system of independent courts. And these performed their tasks in magnificent public buildings located at the heart of the city. The climate must have helped, because a lot of the public life of this culture took place outdoors. The Athenian democracy was not invincible, Just 2 centuries after its inception, it was terminated by the rising power of the Macedonian kingdom. But the fact that the democracy of Athens ultimately failed to hold out against a military dictatorship does nothing to diminish its world historical importance. What was it Winston Churchill told the British Parliament? Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. In that sense, it's easy to understand why Greek architecture is still reflected in so many parliament buildings in Europe today. Symbols representing the power of the people, even if the Athenian form of government has little in common with our modern representative democracy. This is where things come full circle. The idea of democracy, the balance of power, is supposed to be reflected in the golden ratio of the buildings. It all traces back to the Greeks' pursuit of perfection. Democracy would later become one of the founding principles of modern Europe and the cornerstone of this community of nations. Of course, we shouldn't idealize Athenian democracy. Only free male Athenians held citizenship. Women and slaves had no political rights at all. And this democracy, like all democracies, was an untidy and open-ended affair. The nobility were always trying to expand their privileges and even on occasion to overturn the system. The power of money was another problem. When the wealthiest citizens used their cash to secure power, plutocracy loomed. And then there was the power of the public word. Demagogues, the literal translation means leader of the people, was the name the Greeks gave to those gifted orators who sought to sway the masses in their decisions. This didn't have to be a bad thing. When demagogues placed themselves in the service of the political system, they could do great good. But as soon as they placed their own interests or those of a particular faction above those of the city, they became a threat to the general good. And today, in an ever more complex world, the demagogues are prospering once again in Europe. The marathon is the most democratic sporting event of all time. Young, old, fat, thin, anyone can join in the run. Millions of people around the world catch marathon fever every year. This long-distance run is named after a small town in Greece. The first marathon runner of history was completely alone. His name was Philippides, and he ran the approximately 40 kilometers from the town of Marathon to the marketplace in Athens in order to announce the victory of the Greeks over a much larger Persian army in a decisive battle. It's said that he then collapsed dead on the ground, but not before warning the Athenians that the remaining Persian forces were swiftly approaching the city. And so, 490 years before the Christian era, Athenian soldiers move into position. Here's the story. The global superpower of the time, the expansive Persian Empire, feels threatened by the rival cities of Corinth, Sparta, and Athens. The Greeks are united by this common enemy, and they react together with a preemptive strike. For the first time, they feel like Europeans, and they even call their homeland Europe. It is an identity born of a shared fate. Athens defeats the Persians. The war continues, but the future of the continent is decided in the dust of Marathon. The victory at Marathon was a defining moment for the Greek democracy, a sign of what could be achieved through unity and self-confidence. Then, as so often in its history, the destiny of democracy was tied up with war. Above all, the victory at Marathon showed that deeper popular participation in political life can actually heighten the striking power of a state. And the gods too were granted their share. In its gratitude for the victory, the city sacrificed 500 goats every year until the number of slaughtered goats matched the number of Persian dead. The story of that victory is classic Hollywood blockbuster material. Back then it was immediately adapted for the stage. That's right, Athens is also the birthplace of the entertainment industry. The Greeks have loved heroic tales since the days of Homer, and the story of the Persian Wars is no exception. Actors step into the role of their old enemy and relive a victory that all Greeks are proud of.
Be stern and remember, chin up and chest out.
Aeschylus, a veteran of the Battle of Marathon, is the author of this thrilling work.
It's your turn now.
With support from the young politician Pericles, the playwright hopes to win the theatre competition that the Athenians hold every year in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine and mirth. Aeschylus himself hadn't exactly covered himself in glory on the battlefield, but this play would immortalize his name. The playwright portrays the senselessness of war, which leads to nothing but horror, despair, death, and grief. He tells the story from the perspective of the losing side, without denigrating the Persians for their loss. In this way, he hopes to educate his audience. And the Athenians understand his message. The Persians won first prize. It's the oldest surviving theatrical work in the world. From tragedy to comedy, the Greeks showed the world the meaning of good entertainment. The narrative forms established then have survived the test of time, and the play commemorating the event that gave rise to the idea of Europe, the Persian Wars, is still regularly performed on stage even today. Art, architecture, political thought, society in ancient Greece was open and sophisticated, and over the centuries, Europe has drawn again and again from this cultural wellspring. So this is where the roots of our European civilization lie. But outside of Hellas, no one else yet identified themselves as European. So how did the ancient Greeks disseminate their culture? And how did Greek culture become European culture? In the 4th century before the birth of Christ, Macedonian King Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great, conquers all the Greek city-states with the exception of Sparta. He wants to spread Greek culture around the world. He creates a global empire in Asia, which he feels is more promising terrain than the European continent. The Greeks, on the other hand, established colonies around the Mediterranean, including Massalia, today known as Marseille. This is where explorer Pythias sets sail in the 4th century before Christ. A contemporary of Alexander the Great, Pythias wants to explore northern Europe, and his discoveries will revolutionize the Greeks' view of the world. Up to that point, they had believed that the best and most intelligent people could only be found in the Mediterranean. Then Pythias met the Celts, and a new power appeared on the scene. The Celts are not a unified people, and they don't have an empire. Instead, they live in numerous different tribal groups, but they have shared customs, and when they feel threatened, they close ranks. That sounds almost European, you might say. And in fact, in the 1st century BC, the Celts expand their tribal territory from Central Europe to Anatolia and Britannia. Their culture continues to grow and develop. The north is full of nothing but backward barbarians, the Greeks think. They believe that the cold and fog of the north has made the people sluggish. Still, they give the northerners a flattering name, the Celts, or the brave ones. The Greeks are also interested in doing business. They have olives and wine to trade with the Celts for amber and tin. But first, they need to introduce the Celts to Greek culture. A few gifts, mainly gold, helped to solidify their friendship. Pythias, the explorer from Marseille, knows how important this is. He was the first Greek to reach the northern edge of the known world at the time. The Celts are more than just strong warriors. They're also gifted metalworkers, and slowly they develop a taste for the Mediterranean lifestyle, especially for wine. This vessel, as tall as an adult, came from Greece and was found in the tomb of a Celtic chieftainess. The ubiquitous drinking horns are further evidence of the Celts' unquenchable thirst. The Celts were the ones who built the first cities north of the Alps, around 150 of them in fact. One of the most famous is the Heuneburg, located in modern-day southern Germany. It's the oldest known Celtic settlement north of the Alps to be mentioned in literature. Even Greek historian Herodotus was interested in this city. Built in 600 BC, the Hoyneborg was the residence of Celtic chieftains, with clever fortifications to fend off enemies. The Celts carefully organized their lives behind the high walls. They had their own coins and a system for the division of labor. Up to 10,000 people lived in this form of ancient city. From here, the Celts increasingly traded with the Greeks and with Pythias's hometown, Marseille. The Celts weren't exactly methodical when it came to occupation and conquest, but in 387 BC, they briefly conquered Rome, a traumatic experience that remained a vivid memory for the city's ensuing generations. The Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire, isn't an exact model for our modern concept of Europe, of course, but today's Europe certainly has many of its roots in Rome. The idea of the Republic, the laws, the architecture, in many areas the Romans were able to build on what the Greeks had created. The Pantheon is a good example here. Behind the Greek-style facade is one of the oldest and largest domes in Europe, and it's made of cement. Both of those things, Roman inventions. In all areas of life, the Romans looked to the Greeks for inspiration, but they wanted to improve on things as well. The ambitious Gaius Julius Caesar is no exception. He sees a bright future for himself. He dreams of being a conqueror like Alexander the Great. But before he can make history, he has to tread the career path of a Roman civil servant, a long, hard slog. He spares no expense or effort in pursuit of his ambitions, spending enormous sums on bribes, and by the time he becomes consul, Caesar has racked up considerable debts. What he needs now is a war, a campaign of plunder to burnish his reputation and fill his empty coffers. But Caesar has a problem. There's not much left to plunder. His predecessors have already quashed competition around the Mediterranean. His only remaining option is the wild north of Europe, the land of the Celts, or the Gauls, as the Romans call them. Caesar plans to show these barbarians who's boss, 300 years after the Celts themselves had plundered Rome. Better late than never. Which brings us to the bane of every Latin student's existence, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, or Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars. In the region today known as France, Celtic chieftain Vercingetorix attempts to block the path of Caesar's legions, barricading himself into the city of Alesia. Caesar and 50,000 of his legionaries surround the city with 2 layers of circular fortifications, secured with guard towers, moats, and traps. Caesar describes the brutality of this war without betraying a hint of emotion. Vercingetorix sends all the women, children, and elderly out of the city, but they are trapped by the Roman fortifications. Caesar refuses to help them. The wall remains closed. Then Vercingetorix attacks. The battle lasts 4 days. More than once, the Gauls are close to surmounting the Roman walls, but they are beaten back and suffer major losses each time. Finally, the Roman commander himself takes to the front lines of his cavalry, bolstering the wavering ranks of his legionaries. They capture such a large number of prisoners that each legionary receives one as a slave. After 6 years of fighting, Vercingetorix surrenders. His people, the Gauls, are absorbed into the Roman Empire. With this victory, Caesar successfully expands the Roman Empire far into the west. In the 19th century, the Gaulish Vercingetorix becomes French. In modern France, he is still considered a national hero deserving of a monument as a symbol of their unity as a nation. The world of the Celts shrinks after the Battle of Alesia. First, they disappear north of the Alps, and then Caesar conquers Gaul and incorporates it into the Roman Empire. In the end, only the Celts on the British Isles remain. Caesar's path is drenched in blood. By his own account, he had over 1 million lives on his conscience.
Look behind you and remember that you are but a man.
This good advice is drowned out by the cheers of the masses. With the praise heaped upon Caesar, he rises to the status of demigod, and he knows it. Megalomania becomes his constant companion. After his victory over the Gauls, Caesar calls for a victory parade the likes of which have never been seen before. It's an unparalleled show of strength. He dresses as Jupiter, the chief deity in the Roman pantheon. No false modesty here. And Caesar presents his most important trophy, Vercingetorix. He keeps him alive just for this performance. Caesar, conqueror of the barbarians, the message comes across loud and clear. With Caesar, a new idea takes hold in Europe, the concept of empire. Rome had been a republic up to that point, ruled by the nobility. But the senators transfer full control to Caesar, naming him dictator for life. The Roman Republic becomes the Imperium Romanum, incorporating broad swathes of Europe. So, ironically, Europeans have one of the world's greatest egomaniacs to thank for the first political union. European emperors and dictators invoke Caesar's name from Roman times up until the 20th century. His successors, the Caesars, became Kaisers and Tsars. Charlemagne, Ivan the Terrible, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor Wilhelm II, and Benito Mussolini. Caesar's adopted son and heir, Augustus, is the first to truly and firmly establish the idea of empire, and it's under his rule that people become aware of what it means to govern a continent. And this included perfect communication with his subjects across Europe. Augustus, who built this forum, was a master of public relations. He really understood the marketing of power. And here, as you can see, he's depicted on a coin. This is how, for the first time in European history, the image of a ruler traveled 1 million times over. Augustus preempted Andy Warhol's 20th century axiom, expose yourself, take your picture, big yourself up, and send your image around the world. Facebook, Instagram, nothing new there then. As his power increased, Augustus's picture changed. At the beginning, his face was still folded in the worry lines of a politician preoccupied by the res publica, the affairs of state. Later, the lines fell away. The face depicted in pictures and on coins is completely smooth, timeless, and godlike. The image minted here was meticulously designed and thought through by Augustus and his spin doctors. And the message was, you can be proud, Romans, that you reign over the world. This is your calling. The comforts offered by the Roman way of civilization are one of the primary factors driving the success of Greco-Roman civilization. The Romans established colonies everywhere, from southern France and Trier in Germany to Bath in Britain, from the Atlantic to the Balkans. And the dense network of roads they construct in the lands they conquer make it easy for legionaries, traders, and travelers to cross the continent. Roman roads crisscross thousands of kilometers throughout Europe. The Romans organized an entire continent. They connect Europe with their empire and their language, and they unite Europe with their laws. Soon, Roman law would apply everywhere in Europe, governing the daily lives of its peoples and stipulating the means of resolving all disputes. The Romans have a criminal law and a defined code of criminal procedure, which would form the basis for everything that came afterwards. Roman citizenship in particular had a tremendous power to integrate. It was granted to all inhabitants of the Roman Empire in the year 212. Slaves were the only exception. Emperor Caracalla ensured that there was equality before the law, and he also looked to the pleasure of the Romans, ordering that the system of aqueducts be extended and that gigantic thermal baths be built. Whether dressed for the public baths or standing before a court of law, everyone was equal and possessed, in principle at least, the same opportunities for advancement. Theoretically, anyone could assume public office, and the Romans never forced a citizen to give up his own culture. Many of those who fell under Rome's sway wanted in any case to be like the Romans, and so voluntarily assimilated themselves to the Roman norm. And so the Pax Romana came about, internal peace in this huge empire, and with it, a loose community that one might describe as proto-European. But not all Europeans are prepared to trade their freedom for a bath at a Roman spa. The peoples of the regions today known as Germany and Scotland offer stubborn, assertive resistance. Rather than subduing the ruly barbarians, the Romans sealed themselves off. With Hadrian's Wall today on the border between England and Scotland, it was named for the Roman emperor who commissioned its construction. They also set up a border defense system against the Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube rivers, the limes, a 550-kilometer cultural border that cuts right through Europe. On one side are the cities of the Roman Empire, where civilization flourishes. There are magnificent buildings here, spas and bustling marketplaces. When Augustus reigned, many millions of people lived in these cities. Germania, which is not occupied by the Romans, is thinly populated. It looks a bit like a gigantic nature reserve. East of the Rhine live numerous Germanic and Slavic tribes in far-flung villages. It's a completely different world, an archaic world. A handful of travel reports full of stories about the barbarians to the north were circulating in Rome. They were likely the basis for the work of Publius Cornelius Tacitus, whose most famous publication bears the succinct title Germania. The senator and historian apparently never traveled to the wild north of Europe himself, but that didn't stop him from writing 46 chapters about these backward barbarian tribes in the year 98 AD. He describes them as slovenly dressers, and he makes mention of their simple foods and their unusually intoxicating drink, something called beer, which was unknown in Rome at the time. Tacitus praises the hospitality of the Germanic tribes, their modesty and their bravery, but in fact his aim is to hold a mirror up to Roman society. He's particularly impressed with the marital fidelity of the northerners, but he also mentions their tendency to drink to excess and to gamble on games of dice. Of course, what else can they be expected to do in such barren, wooded country? Tacitus wonders. He puts all these musings to paper as he continues to marvel at these exotic Teutons. There is brisk trade between the Romans and the Germanic tribes in the border regions via gates in the limes. On the whole, the European neighbors seem to have come to an arrangement. Only occasionally do the numeri, a Roman rapid response force, need to step in. Like border police, they take action against the frequent raids plotted by Germanic hordes against the wealthy Romans on the other side of the wall. But walls and fences aren't a permanent solution, and the Romans learned that the hard way. When nomadic Asian tribes invade Europe in the 4th century, the old order crumbles. Roman officer and historian Ammianus Marcellinus describes the arrival of the Hun peoples, saying that they were excited by an unrestrained desire of plundering the possessions of others, and that they went on ravishing and slaughtering all the nations in their neighborhood. After more than 300 years, the Pax Romana, the peace within the Roman Empire, comes to an end. Germanic tribes descend on the empire as refugees and as conquerors. The Goths are the first to seek refuge in the empire. They cross the Danube in 376. Other Germanic tribes would follow. Ammianus Marcellinus observes this mass migration and reports on large numbers of unfamiliar barbarian tribes composed of various nations, now with all their families wandering about in different directions on the banks of the river Danube. At first, this intelligence was lightly treated by our people, he writes, and in fact the Romans gradually lose control, first over their borders and then over their empire. The empire is finally divided in the year 395 into a Western and an Eastern Roman Empire. This migration period upsets the balance of ancient Europe, but at the same time, Europe as we know it begins to take shape. Germanic kingdoms arise in the territory of Western Rome, including the powerful Franconia in the region that is today Germany and France. I've traveled to the Angles and Saxons in England, or to be more specific, to Cambridge. Europe has always been about movement. Peoples and nations came and went, everything got mixed up. And the record of this long history of more or less constant movement over thousands of years is recorded in the genetic material of the Europeans. And with the modern methods of gene technology, we can read it. Every individual can find out what kind of a mix he or she is made up of. And that's interesting. I, for example, would very much like to know how much of Europe is inside me as an Australian and what paths my ancestors followed on the old continent. With some patience and a little bit of saliva, I can find it out. I'm going to send this sample to a laboratory in the United States. My genetic material will be deciphered, and I'm looking forward to getting the result. By the way, all of this is only possible because Francis Crick and James Watson discovered here in Cambridge how our genetic material is constructed. And it was in this pub that they first informed the public of their discoveries in 1953. Pop this into the post box. Let's see what they say. I'm eagerly awaiting my results, and 2 weeks later, they arrive. The results of my gene test are in. And here we have it. 78.5% of me is British or Irish, that's hardly surprising. At least 5.1% is French or German. Apparently you can't distinguish between French and German genes. 2.5% is Scandinavian, and 11% of my genes come from the North European and Baltic Sea region. That must be the Viking in me. But I'm also 0.7% Sardinian. I'm particularly proud of that element of my genetic heritage. And then there are the Neanderthal genes, which apparently we all have, and the DNA from North Africa, apparently that too is universal, and from the Middle East. All the result of migratory movement to and within Europe. History has been mixing Europe together since the Stone Age, and even I, as an Australian, am part of that story. It's this extraordinary diversity, this blend of languages and cultures, that has always triggered movement in Europe, just as it did in the Roman era when the Imperium Romanum collapsed. It was a gradual process. The supposed decadence of late Roman culture wasn't the only thing that led to its downfall. What does an empire look like as it disintegrates? The continuous civil war and declining economy of Western Rome means that that part of the empire has essentially already dissolved. Child Emperor Romulus Augustulus sits on the imperial throne. The influence of the Germanic tribes has grown significantly. Now they seize complete control of Western Europe. The story of the Roman Empire in the West ends after 503 years with the dethronement of the child emperor by Germanic leader Odoacer in the year 476.
Take the imperial mantle to Byzantium. Tell the Emperor of East Rome that we no longer need it. Not here. From now on, I'll have a new title. Rex Italiae, King of Italy.
This fountain in the middle of Rome, right in front of the Pantheon, tells a typically European story. The Roman emperors loved obelisks because, as the ancient Egyptians already knew, obelisks are a kind of antenna to the gods. So they caused them, this one for example dates from the time of Ramses II, to be brought to the Eternal City. 1,000 years later, Pope Clement XI had it erected here and added another antenna in the form of a cross on top. And here you can see his coat of arms. The dolphins were added later during the Baroque and represent Christ, the Redeemer of souls. And then there's the water in the fountain itself. The worship of river gods and spring nymphs was of course a widespread practice among the Greeks. And for Plato, the philosopher, water always performed an allegorical function. Plato compared the ideal state to a body of clear waters into which all springs and brooks flow and merge. And one could compare this fountain with Europe itself. What was there in its past is constantly mingling with something new. From this dynamic mixture, great things can grow. So, what remains? For me, Rome's most beautiful building is the Pantheon with its massive dome. It's a place that reflects the highs and lows of European history like no other. I want to go back there one more time. The resonance of this place conveys something of its immensity. This really is a breathtaking temple. When Michelangelo first clapped eyes on the Pantheon in Rome, he thought that such an architectural wonder could scarcely have been created by mortal hands, but must have been the work of angels. And perhaps he was right, because that would explain why the Pantheon survived the devastating destructions of the Teutons in Rome, as well as a couple of earthquakes. At any rate, the seizure of power by the Teutons turned out not to be the end of European history. On the contrary, it further enriched the unique mix on whose foundations European civilization rests until this day, because instead of destroying the ancient culture of the Greeks and Romans, the Germanic warriors cultivated this legacy. A further ingredient was still to come: Christianity. What will bind the Europeans together, but also bitterly divide them, is their faith. This doesn't look European at all, you might say. But there's also an Oriental Europe, and that's what I'm looking for here in Istanbul. Istanbul is the only major city in the world that straddles two continents, the European and the Asian, on which I'm standing here, and between them, the Bosphorus. one of the world's most strategically sensitive waterways. The geography is straightforward enough, but where Europe begins and where it ends is also a question of religion. Today it's fashionable to define Europe in terms of a Western Judeo-Christian tradition, and yet the origins of this tradition lie outside Europe, in the Middle East, in Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And Paul, the most important of the early Christian missionaries, came from Tarsus in today's Turkey. And this place too, Constantinople, today Istanbul, once shaped the Christian culture of Europe. I'm in Istanbul in the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom that has stood on this spot for 1,500 years. Before the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, this was the largest Christian church in the world, and Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the cultural heart of Europe. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, the Hagia Sophia became a mosque. But the 11th century mosaics still remain as a testimony to the era of Christendom. Today, this building is mainly a museum, although parts of it are once again in use as a mosque. In this place, we can clearly see how similar these religions actually are and which sources they draw from. Nowhere else were the power of the Roman emperors and the authority of the Christian church as tightly intertwined as in this immense structure. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II marked the victory by riding into the church and conducting the Muslim Friday prayer. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque, and it remained one until 1935, when it was redesignated as a museum. But today, things are changing. The call to prayer of the Muezzin again rings out from the four minarets, and an imam has recently been appointed. Important historical buildings like this one have always been put to political use, and that instrumentalization continues today. The central themes of the Mosaic Bible and the Christian New Testament can nearly all be traced back to sources in Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, and the Levant. Moses' 10 Commandments, for example, probably have their origins in ethical injunctions he encountered in Egypt. And the notion that the soul is immortal and that a divine judgment awaits the dead could also be found in the kingdom of the pharaohs. Christianity, that central strand of the continent's history, was not a European invention. What gave Christianity the power to unite Europe over and over again? Part of the answer can be found in the New Testament, in the book known as Apostles. Having once himself mercilessly persecuted the Christians, Paul, a Greek Jew from Tarsus, becomes a fervent believer in the teachings of Christ. Forgiveness and benevolence are the key to the kingdom of heaven, he preaches, just as Jesus revealed. He presses against the prevailing mentality of the time. He favors forgiveness over condemnation, mercy over revenge. His message is that God is there for everyone, even the poor and downtrodden, and Paul practices what he preaches. On his journeys, he leads by example, standing up for the weak. Paul traveled many thousands of kilometers on roads like these, or more often, on rough terrain, or even by boat. And in the process, he laid the foundations for a global church, because Paul's Christianity was an offer to everyone. Initially, to be sure, it was above all the poor and the weak who responded to his call. But the brothers and sisters in the faith stuck together. Some were even prepared to die for their religion, an act of witness that was not lost on all of their contemporaries. What began as a movement of underdogs is today, with 2.3 billion members, the largest faith community in the world. But the rise of Christianity doesn't begin in Jerusalem. It starts in York, England. This is where Constantine the Great is named Roman Emperor in the year 306, or rather quarter emperor. At this point, the empire is divided up between 4 emperors. They don't rule from Rome, but from modern-day Milan, Trier, Sirmium, and Izmit. Why is it Constantine, of all people, who helps Christianity become an established major religion?
Where is my mother?
Over there, my lord.
Behind every powerful man is a strong woman, they used to say, and in such cases, a mother can be especially influential. Helena, Constantine's mother, is a fine example. While Constantine primarily views Christianity as a means to power, Helena is baptized. She is a true believer in the superiority of the Christian God. It is likely Constantine's mother who familiarizes the emperor with the new religion, ushering in a new era for Europe. She would later be canonized by the church. And then, before a decisive battle, legend has it that Constantine receives a vision. God tells him that he should go into battle marked with the sign of Christ, that it will help him defeat his enemies. At the time, Constantine was anything but a conventional Christian. It isn't until many years later, just before his death, that he resolves to be baptized. But Constantine extends his autocratic rule under the banner of Christianity, and the Christogram becomes his trademark. His struggle for power is the first religious war, the first crusade, and the beginning of a fateful alliance between the church and the state that will last into Europe's modern era. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, as depicted by Renaissance painter Raphael, Constantine I defeats his rival Maxentius to become sole ruler. He believes that God has granted him this victory, and in gratitude, he launches the process of Christianizing the Roman Empire. Constantine celebrates his victory over his rivals with a triumphal procession in the year 312. Like Caesar, who saw himself as a demigod, Constantine parades towards the Temple of Jupiter, but under a Christian banner. However, unlike his hero, Constantine symbolically turns around when he's halfway to the temple.
Halt! Turn around.
But, my emperor.
Turn around. Now.
The crowd isn't expecting this, and they boo him as he rides away. It's a good visual representation of what would come to be called the Constantinian shift. Christianity is becoming more and more influential, and half a century later, it will become the official religion. But what were the reasons for the success of Christianity? Well, first there's the fact that the alliance of the church with the powerful Roman imperial state greatly increased its appeal. The church was open to anyone who wanted to join. This had never been the case with the Jews. Then there was the Christian belief in deliverance and salvation in the hereafter. Death was no longer final. For those who'd endured a great deal of suffering in their lives, this was a powerful and attractive argument. It seemed that what Jesus had promised them was something the many heathen gods they'd worshipped up till now simply couldn't offer. The Christian church could even forgive sins in the name of Jesus, something that would have seemed very strange to the Apostle Paul. According to the old Jewish tradition, the forgiveness of sins was something reserved to God and the Last Judgment. The emperor commissions the construction of the Arch of Constantine in Rome to mark this major victory. It's a symbol of his claim to power. Constantine adorned his claim to power with Christian symbols, portraying the events and decisions of his reign as expressions of God's will. It's an invincible combination. We can see here the roots of the religiously sanctioned violence that in later centuries would scar the history of Europe and its global expansion. In the year 324, Constantine the Great turns his back on Rome forever. He heads to the Bosporus, to Byzantium, where he constructs his new capital, Constantinople, today known as Istanbul. It becomes the center of Christian culture, outshining even Rome. Where today the skyline is dominated by minarets, Constantine and his successors built churches, He wanted Christ Pantocrator, ruler of the world, to radiate from this city to the rest of Europe as the mosaics and paintings in the Chora Church indicate. Back then, the actual heart of Christendom was not in Rome, but in the east of Europe. But what became of Rome, that eternal city where everything supposedly began, ravaged by the raids of Germanic tribes from the 5th century onwards? And Rome, the former world metropolis, fell into decline and decay. Ruins everywhere. What didn't decline with ancient Rome was Roman Christianity. The Germanic tribal leaders accepted and adopted the faith, albeit in a somewhat simplified form. And so the Germans in Rome became Roman Christians and thereby heirs to the Roman imperial heritage. A profound rupture and at the same time a deep continuity. In the history of Europe, this is not a contradiction. And at the other end of the continent, far to the west, it's Ireland, of all places, that Emerald Isle at the outer edge of Europe, never conquered by the Romans, that becomes one of the most important starting points for the process of Christianization. Irish missionaries begin to find their way into other countries as early as the 6th century. But why does it all start in Ireland? Here in Ireland is where Christianity and the nature-worshipping faith of the Celts meet. The Book of Kells, a true treasure of the Middle Ages, is a good example of the way these two religions crossed paths. Filled with images of nature, it blends traditional Celtic motifs with Christian symbols. It was this distinctive mix, the simplicity and the credibility of a religion that had not yet drifted too far from its heathen roots, that gave Irish Christianity its special appeal. And Irish monasteries were special in another respect as well. They were open to young people who wished to study without necessarily becoming monks or nuns. And this open traffic between the cloister and the world beyond was another important feature of early Irish Christianity. It all starts in the 4th century with a monk named Patrick, the son of a Roman officer from Britannia. He is considered the apostle of Ireland. At the time, Ireland is still a land of druids and pagans. According to legend, Patrick starts a fire on the Hill of Slane at Easter in the year 433. The fire is larger and burns longer than the one set by his pagan opponents on the Hill of Tara, an ancient Celtic ritual site across the valley. And that is Patrick's strategy in a nutshell. Ireland's patron saint wins people over with simple signs and symbols, feeding their spiritual hunger and helping them become devout Christians. He explained the Trinity, for example, with the help of a clover leaf. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Today, the clover leaf is the national symbol of the Irish, an icon like St. Patrick himself. Monasteries like Clonmacnoise served as an incubator for this fledgling religious faith in Ireland. St. Patrick was clever enough not to contradict the prevailing social order or act against the clans in the country. He imported the Roman alphabet and helped to ensure that the Celtic traditions were recorded in writing. In order to understand the expansiveness of Irish religion, the scope of its influence across Western Europe, we need to remember another peculiarity of the Irish monks, namely the peregrinatio pro Christo, the pilgrimage for Christ, which was not a journey to a specific sacred location, but a protracted exile of wandering, in which the monks took upon themselves the risks and privations of early medieval travel as a kind of penance, a form of martyrdom. Far from their beloved country, their language, and their kinship groups, a form of ascetic piety without which the course of the spread of Christianity in Europe might have been very different. In the 6th century, the monks Columbanus and Gallus gather 10 of their religious brothers around them in remembrance of the 12 apostles. The walking stick, the symbol of pilgrims, becomes their trademark. They set out to convert their European neighbors on the continent. For them, all of life is a pilgrimage. the Irish monks bring Christianity to Gallia, modern-day Switzerland, to Italy, to Galicia, and later to places as far off as Iceland. Monasteries are established throughout the continent, creating a tight-knit Christian network. Columbanus is responsible for the establishment of over 300 monasteries in the Frankish Empire alone. The missionary is memorialized in Luxeuil, in the Vosges region of France. When Columbanus and Gallus encounter pagan ritual sites, their radical side rears its head. They invoke the Old Testament, which reads, "You must tear down their pagan altars and shatter their sacred pillars."
There is much for us to do here, Gallus. In the name of God, our Holy Father.
The missionary efforts of the Irish monks have a lasting effect. In fact, Columbanus and Gallus were the ones who brought church bells to the continent, which still call the faithful to worship today.
Welcome.
And growing numbers of pagans to convert to Christianity. During the migration period and the various invasions of the Roman Empire, many state structures collapsed. The only force that was still capable of creating and maintaining a certain degree of order was Christianity. It wasn't just a matter of belief. The church became an organizing force in the life of the people, steadily expanding its power and its moral authority. Between the 6th and the 10th centuries, this melding of Roman and Germanic elements created something entirely new. Monasteries now become the nucleus of Christian culture in Europe. Gallus settles near Lake Constance in modern-day Switzerland. The city of St. Gallen is named after him. Here, hundreds of years later, a monastery is constructed over his grave. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the monasteries shape more than just people's faith. Their libraries are the new centers of knowledge in Europe. The ancient wisdom of the Greeks and Romans is also preserved here, although the prevailing mindset of the era would label its authors pagans. The old works are carried over into a new age. It was like a salvage operation for world cultural heritage. Respect for the traditions and knowledge of previous generations would become a defining characteristic of European culture. This is how monasteries and churches become the focal points of European civilization in the Middle Ages. And because they're at the center of cities and villages on the continent, they also shape the landscape. They may come in different shapes and sizes, but church spires are always a defining feature of Europe. Even today, the influence of Christianity can be felt throughout Europe, including here in Reims. Over the centuries, so many creations, from music and literature to the incredible architecture of the churches, were inspired by a desire to praise God. Reims, with its famous cathedral, could be called the birthplace of a Christian Europe. This is where Clovis, king of the Franks and founder of the Merovingian dynasty, was baptized as a reward for defeating the tribe of the Alemanni. Legend has it that during the decisive battle, he cried out, "Jesus Christ, if you give me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and will be baptized in your name." Very much like Emperor Constantine in ancient Rome. Another case of the powerful falling back on religion for support. Clovis allied himself with the influential Roman Catholic Church, a decisive step that enabled the Frankish rulers over time to merge with their Gallo-Roman subjects. This solemn baptism on Christmas Day in the year 500 left a lasting impression on the people of the day. 3,000 warriors decided to be baptized alongside Clovis, prefiguring the eventual conversion of the entire Frankish people to the Christian faith. Clovis's conversion laid the spiritual foundations for Charlemagne's immense empire and for a Christian Europe. Naturally, Clovis's successors also expand their power as they spread the Christian religion. Charlemagne is particularly ruthless. He ignores the Christian message of brotherly love, deciding to focus instead on conversion by the sword. Thousands die as a result. The Saxons suffer most for their resistance to Charlemagne, who uses extreme violence to bring them to heel. They are forced to convert to Christianity. But for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, broad swathes of Western Europe are unified and even share the same faith. The Frankish Empire would later become France, Germany, and the Benelux countries, the core countries of the modern-day European Union. EU officials seem to have learned a thing or two from Charlemagne. The emperor enacted Europe's first agricultural regulations, which dictated the medicinal and crop plants that could be found in his empire, as well as the standards of quality those plants had to meet. These regulations were strictly enforced at the empire's markets. There were also standardized units of weight and a standard currency, the denarius, or Charlemagne penny.
How much for all?
Just 1 denarius.
The denarius is used as currency in France and beyond, even in England. Europe had an economic and monetary union of sorts 1,200 years before the introduction of the euro. It's no wonder that Charlemagne is celebrated as the father of Europe today. His capital, Aachen, is considered the Rome of the North. Art and culture reach a new peak under Charlemagne, earning this era the name Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne brings scholars from all over Europe to his court, and his court school becomes the heart of education on the continent, bringing forth new ideas in poetry, theology, and historiography. A collective memory is born. Charlemagne makes the ancient world accessible to the Germanic peoples. The writing system also develops during this period. The Carolingian minuscule forms the basis for the Times New Roman font that we still use today. Charlemagne's power politics, with all the associated crusades and conquests, helped the Frankish Empire become a global power, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the fall of Western Rome. Aachen, with its magnificent imperial palace, was Charlemagne's main place of residence, but the emperor was always on the move, keeping a firm grip on the far-flung territories of his empire. Whenever he was home, he enjoyed the local culture and luxuries, including the hot springs. He specifically built his imperial palace across from a Roman bath. The foundation and scale of today's Aachen City Hall are identical to the former royal residence. This is where all the royal feasts and coronations were held. The octagonal Aachen Cathedral is another famous Carolingian landmark. The architects of the age clearly drew on Byzantine art in their designs. The focal point is the marble throne. The ruler who sits here has nothing above him but the heavens, and below him are his people. But Charlemagne wants to be more than just king of the Franks. He has bigger plans. He hopes to secure lasting power for the Frankish people. In autumn of the year 800, he crosses the Alps to Rome, with a large procession in tow. His destination is old St. Peter's Basilica, which once stood where the dome of the cathedral rises above the city today. The Pope would crown him emperor here on Christmas Day, a spectacle of historic proportions. Charlemagne wears the crimson robes of the ancient Roman emperors. A ruler of a Germanic tribe takes up the mantle of the Roman rulers and becomes the founder of the Western European medieval empire. The emperor swears an oath to restore the Roman Empire and to protect the Holy Roman Church. In the centuries to come, the Holy Roman Emperors will continue to be crowned here. But the Franks are not the only ones spreading their faith at sword point across Europe. The Christian West was on the rise in the Middle Ages, but so was the Islamic West. In April 711, the Muslim Moors of North Africa land on the southern tip of Spain. Within 7 years, they've conquered almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. The invaders cross the Pyrenees and advance deep into France, reaching as far as Tours. The Franks call on the Europeans to fight back and stop the invaders. Charles Martel, an experienced strategist, serves as the military leader of the Franks, Lombards, and Aquitanians. The Arab warriors are feared. In recent decades, they have conquered the Middle East and North Africa, but Charles Martel's men have sworn to hold the line at all costs. They repel the invaders, and the battle is later exalted as a fight for Europe itself. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Moors hold their ground and establish the Islamic Empire of Al-Andalus, which would shape the southwest of Europe for nearly 800 years. As the capital city, Cordoba begins to expand. By the end of the millennium, this home of the caliphs is the most important metropolis in the Western world, a megacity with 500,000 residents. The mosque the Moors construct on the ruins of a Roman temple and a Christian church is the largest house of worship in the world at the time. Today, it's a Christian cathedral once again. That's Europe for you, always this back and forth. Does Islam belong in Europe? Well, it's certainly part of the history of the European continent, and at times it's been a deeply important part of that history. Islamic medieval Spain became the conduit between Western Europe and the great academies of the Middle East. In centers of learning like Baghdad, Muslim scholars were pushing back the horizons of knowledge. It's not just that scholars in the Arabic tradition translated and analyzed important works from ancient Greek and thereby preserved them for the West. Muslim scientists also engaged in experimental research, even citing passages in the Quran that called upon the faithful to observe nature as a divine sign and to obtain knowledge. An Islamic renaissance began. Biology, zoology, geography, optometry, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics all boomed. And this new knowledge was also taught in the Muslim universities of Spain, which were attended by Jewish and Catholic students, including the man who would later become Pope Sylvester II. And this is how the expertise of the Arab world came to the European continent. For nearly a millennium, Islam was a culturally decisive force in Europe. The Alhambra in Granada is an eloquent expression of that fact. The caliph's open-minded, cosmopolitan attitude attracts scholars from all over Europe and the Middle East, and as a result, something incredible happens here in the south of the continent. Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars launched what one might call a joint research project. Jewish scholars helped to translate the ancient writings collected and translated by the Arabs, including works by Aristotle, into Latin, making them accessible to Christian Europe and preserving them for generations to come. Even back then, it was clear that cooperation between the Arabic and Hebraic cultures could be extremely productive. It seems that we still have something to learn from the golden age of Al-andalus. So Europe definitely benefited from Muslim rule over the Iberian Peninsula, and the European zest for research through experimentation likely had its roots in this era. But then it all came to a very sudden end. The Alhambra in Granada was the last bastion of the Moors in Spain. In 1492, the last of the emirs to rule in this magnificent fortress was obliged to surrender the key to the Queen of Spain, Isabella of Castile. The Moors were promised freedom of religion by the ruling Spaniards, but this tolerance was soon replaced by religious zealotry. The First Crusade had sown a spirit of conquest and persecution throughout Europe. Pope Urban II fired the starting shot from Clermont in the French Auvergne when he convened a synod against immorality and faithlessness and called on the faithful to arm themselves and travel to Jerusalem. It had become increasingly difficult to access the holy sites there. Deus lo volt, it is God's will, Pope Urban declared, and thousands followed his call, nobles, knights and peasants alike. All of them were driven by the Pope's promise of heavenly rewards and the forgiveness of sins. The slaughter began before the Crusaders had even left Europe. Among the first victims of the Crusades were the Jews in cities such as Mainz and Speyer, where Jewish life, culture and faith were an integral part of urban life. Their neighborhoods and shops helped shape the face of those cities. They worked as traders and artisans. In a sense, the period before the Crusades had been a golden age of relatively peaceful coexistence between Jews and Christians in Western Europe. The local rulers protected the individual Jewish communities, which had their own administrative structures. The synagogue was the focal point of community life. Synagogues were centers of spiritual life and tradition. But now, during the Crusades, the Jews were targeted as the enemies of Christ, the infidels of Europe. Horrifying pogroms were the result. Thousands of Jews were murdered or committed suicide. It was a prefiguration of the anti-Semitism of centuries to come, and it casts a long shadow over European history. In fact, the primary mission of the Crusaders was to remove the other so-called infidels who controlled the territory that housed Christ's tomb. In June 1099, after 3 years, the Christian armies finally reached their destination, Jerusalem. This city was home to some of the most important Christian holy places. In recent years, it had been alternately dominated by various opposing forces under whose rule non-Muslims had often suffered. The Crusaders wanted to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity. And what followed was a bloody siege with heavy losses. The Christian Crusaders were responsible for the gruesome murders of thousands of Muslims and Jews. They then constructed churches on the ruins of the destroyed mosques and synagogues. Sadly, the First Crusade is only the beginning. The Europeans would pillage and plunder the Holy Land 4 more times. Jerusalem remains a bone of contention among the 3 monotheistic world faiths today. For centuries, the Crusades would strain the relationship between East and West and between Muslims and Christians. And then, the pendulum swings in the other direction. In 1453, Constantinople falls to its enemies. The Ottomans strike at the heart of Christianity in the East. The city is plundered. The conquerors advance all the way to the Hagia Sophia, where many residents have sought refuge. There is another bloodbath. But the fall of Constantinople doesn't mean the end of Christianity in the east of Europe. The faith had long since made its way northward, where it found its new center. I'm on my way to the Kiev Monastery of Caves, founded in 1051. It's a place rich in symbolism. The Patriarch of Moscow regularly holds church services here, and I'm attending one today. The piety of the Eastern Orthodox Church is characterized by fixed rituals. The Mass, liturgy, and sacraments cannot be changed. These believers rejected the Pope and still do so today. For them, churches are the place where God resides, but nothing more. There is no organ, just voices raised in song. Kiev was the first center of Russian Christianity. It was known as the Jerusalem of the East. Only in the 14th century did Moscow begin to emerge as the religious capital of Orthodox Christendom. Since the era of Emperor Constantine, Byzantium had been the second Rome. After the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in the 15th century, Moscow was hailed as the third. Tretyi Rim, the third Rome, signified not just religious authority, but also imperial power. The Russian rulers called themselves Tsars, Caesars, or emperors, and in this tradition they were also defenders of the Christian faith. They ruled over the Eastern Church, which defined itself in opposition to the Catholic Church of the West. Both churches continued to vie for supremacy, and the alienation between them has never entirely been overcome. This can also be felt in Ukraine, which lies on the crossroads between Eastern and Central Europe. Orthodoxy dominates in the east of the country, but several million Western Ukrainians view Rome as the center of their faith. And here again, as so often in the history of Europe, we're confronted with the question, is Christianity a unifying bond or a divisive force? And what about Western Christianity? In the 14th century, there are two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon in southern France. At one point, there are actually three. They're all fighting over the Holy See. They seem more interested in wealth and power than in the salvation of the faithful. Critics increasingly begin to question the medieval order of Western Europe, which is dominated by the emperor and the pope. Many of the faithful abandon the church altogether. In an era of starvation, plague, and discord, a papal church focused only on itself provides little stability or hope for the people. A new movement begins here in Prague, primarily led by priest and theology professor Jan Hus, who becomes a prominent critic of the old church. Hus is the rector at the renowned Charles University and a highly respected figure. He blasts the clergy in his lectures and sermons, gradually attracting larger and larger crowds of interested followers. He rejects Latin, opting instead to deliver his message in the language of the people, and they're hearing him loud and clear.
Now I tell you, our church needs no pope. Not at all. Nowhere does the Bible mention him. Our Lord Jesus Christ would lead our faith much better through you.
Jan Hus repeatedly denounces the practices of the papal church, which he feels are capitalizing on people's fear of hellfire and damnation.
The church promises you salvation for buying letters of indulgence, but all they want is to fill their coffers.
Yes, he's right.
Here is one of them. He's got a coffer right in his hands.
There is no longer a distinction between church leaders and secular rulers, Hus argues, just as English theologian John Wycliffe had done before him. Jan Hus's ideas light a spark that burns like a wildfire across Europe. Only God can forgive sins. Hus's critics burn his books in retaliation. The emperor summons the agitator to Constance. A formal council is called to resolve the schism in the church and silence the heretic. After weeks of interrogation and torture, Jan Hus is subjected to the same fate as his writings. He's burned at the stake. But his ideas live on. St. Peter's Basilica. This colossal structure, built in the 16th century, is the power of the papal church rendered into stone. But just as they were putting the finishing touches to St. Peter's, the Reformation broke out in Western and Central Europe. The power of the popes was shaken. The Reformation never quite reached Rome, but it did divide the European continent. Martin Luther coined a revolutionary term, the priesthood of all believers. The printing press facilitated the spread of ideas on an industrial scale. Where the Reformed religion gained ground, the monopoly of the old church over the interpretation of sacred text was lost. Luther burns the document containing the Pope's official threat of excommunication. He has already drawn up and distributed 95 theses directed mainly against the practice of selling indulgences. This is the spark that ignites the Reformation. Support for Luther among the people is growing. They see him as a champion for their cause. Luther takes a strong stance against an ecclesiastical system that seems to be commercializing the forgiveness of sins, just like Jan Hus 100 years before him. He says, even councils of bishops can make mistakes. And this is when the split with the Catholic Church comes about. Luther is summoned to the Diet of Worms, where he is told he must renounce his theses. He's chosen a difficult path for himself and everyone involved.
In his writings, he questioned the authority of the Church and thus destroyed the unity of Christendom.
Luther stands his ground, invoking God's protection.
God help me. Amen.
Luther is placed under imperial ban and declared an outlaw in the empire, but he's granted safe passage. Soldiers escort him back to Wartburg Castle, where the reformer would be extremely productive in the months to come. Luther's theses are now reprinted thousands of times over. The reformers refuse to be silenced. Luther translates the New Testament into German for the people. A broad segment of the European populace is on his side. They can now read the Bible themselves or have it read to them.
As Jesus sat near the temple treasury, he watched the people as they dropped in their money. Many rich men dropped in a lot of money. Then a poor widow came along and dropped in 2 little copper coins worth about a penny.
One of Luther's early followers is French pastor John Calvin. Persecution of Protestants soon begins in his home country, and he flees to Switzerland. Like Luther, he believes that the written word of the Bible is the only thing that matters. He never studied theology, but he continues to refine Luther's ideas in his own way. Calvin is stricter than Luther. He places particular emphasis on values such as thrift and discipline. The protest against the papal church divides the continent, even across national borders. In the Christian West, unity is a thing of the past. During the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, Parisian Protestants are slaughtered on the king's orders. The massacre is a prelude to a wave of murders throughout the country. More than 10,000 people lose their lives. The Catholic kings of France enforce the primacy of their religion with violence. It was the most gruesome conflict the continent had experienced up to that point, and it began in 1618. The 30 Years' War divided the countries of Europe into fiercely opposed camps. It's no longer about religion, and it hasn't been for some time. It's about power across all denominations. Adherents to the various Christian faiths fight for control of Europe in the name of God. Christians against Christians. It's one of the greatest tragedies the continent has ever seen, surpassed only by the 2 world wars of the 20th century. This seminal catastrophe of European history, a struggle over religion and power, claimed 6 million lives. For 3 decades, Central Europe is a battlefield. Only then do cooler heads prevail. History is made in Westphalia. Around 1645, the representatives of the warring parties make their way to the cities of Osnabrück and Münster to seek a solution to the stalemate. Now it's the diplomats' turn. Nearly all the great powers of Europe are represented here. It's the first pan-European peace conference in history, a year-long experiment with an uncertain outcome. No one wants to be shortchanged, and everyone wants to come away looking good. But reaching a compromise proves difficult. It's a skill they still need to learn. Finally, in May 1648, delegates from Spain and the Netherlands finally make a breakthrough after 3 years of negotiations. At Münster City Hall, they are the first to sign the Treaty of Westphalia. The other European powers follow suit in the months to come. Should the madding world not betake itself to peace, a weighty punishment shall it face, cries an angel on this flyer from 1646. He's addressing the envoys to the negotiations surrounding the Peace of Westphalia. The angel was expressing the people's most fervent wish. They wanted peace. But how did the delegates who traveled from all over Europe to Münster manage to achieve it? Over there, in the Austrian state archives behind the Hofburg Imperial Palace, is the original Treaty of Westphalia. As so often in European history, numerous compromises were required to bring about this peaceful resolution. And here it is, the birth certificate of modern diplomacy. A major war was brought to an end, not by the victory of one of the antagonists, but through negotiation. And here you can see the peace treaty, and at the end of it, the seals and the signatures of the representatives of the signatory powers. France here the negotiator, the chief negotiator for the Kaiser, Vollmar, here Brandenburg, Saxony, Bamberg, the city of Frankfurt. All of Central Europe is represented here. Deadly enemies became partners in a community of equal nations. It was the beginning of international law as we still know it today, nearly 370 years later. The Peace of Westphalia also marks another important departure, at least in Western Europe. In the years that followed, Europeans would continue to wage wars against one another, but they gradually came to accept that it was best to keep religion and politics separate. Europe is a restless continent, a continent that is constantly reinventing itself. It began to project its power into the world. The expansion of the European frontier was one of the most momentous events of all human history. The world became the theater for the playing out of European power struggles. But these encounters with other peoples and their cultures and commodities in turn had a transformative impact on Europe itself. The history of Europe's expansion is a narrative of entrepreneurial spirit, technology, curiosity, and courage, but also of violence, suppression, and exploitation. Geography has always shaped Europe's opportunities right from the very beginning. The continent is flanked to the north, the south, and the west by seas and oceans. 68,000 kilometers of coast, 3 times more than the United States. Crossing the water was the only way to expand. For people desperate to escape overpopulation, poverty, war, and hunger, there was no other option but to leave by sea, and that's still true today. Europeans have always been driven by a thirst for adventure, a lust for power, and not least by greed. And their geographical destiny ensured that they were excellent seafarers. The Vikings construct seaworthy ships and set sail. 1,200 years before our era, they flee the harsh and unforgiving climate of the European north, constantly seeking new targets for their raids. They're talented shipbuilders and navigators, but their brutal conquests soon make them one of the most feared peoples in Europe. It begins on a June night in the year 793 with a raid on the island monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of northern England. The monks are peacefully going about their work when they notice the ships rapidly approaching the island. They sense disaster, the first Viking raid. The Vikings storm the monastery armed with swords and axes, slaughtering the terrified monks. It's a bloodbath. The raiders plunder the monastery of its gold, silver, gemstones, and anything else that looks valuable. They soon make a name for themselves all over Europe with their hit-and-run raids. People everywhere utter the prayer, "O Lord, protect us from the wrath of the Northmen." But the Vikings push the boundaries of their territory further and further. Eventually they become more than just the terrifying raiders from the far north. They evolve into a well-equipped, confident maritime power. They discover Iceland and Greenland, and they advance as far as Newfoundland, where they establish settlements. They were the first to land on the coast of North America 1,000 years ago, but it was in Europe that they really left their mark, and their legendary raids aren't the only thing they're remembered for. Many regions bear their name. Normandy in France is named after these Northmen. And here where I'm standing, on the shores of the Gulf of Finland, the Northmen were known as the Rus, or the rowers, and that's why today this part of Europe is called Russia. The Vikings certainly got around in Europe. They made themselves at home wherever they went, and these erstwhile terrorists from the north created what was essentially the continent's first economic union. Networks and interconnections of this kind enhanced the cohesion of Europe as a cultural space. Westminster Abbey in London, Mont Saint-Michel in northern France, and deep in the south of Italy, the Palazzo dei Normanni in Palermo. The Vikings also made their mark on the continent's architecture. The impressive Norman citadel known as the Castel del Monte, later used as a palace by the Hohenstaufen dynasty, is a case in point. European marketplaces become a lot more colorful thanks to the Vikings. They're able to offer a broader range of merchandise, including more exotic items. Traders return from long journeys with luxury goods. Initially intended for the nobility, these products soon begin to find a wider market. And spices from India are the best sellers of all. The Vikings pave the way, and German merchants soon follow in their footsteps, creating the Hanseatic League. Good business is always the goal. Trade missions spring up in the north and east. There are up to 300 flourishing Hanseatic cities. The trade in furs, pelts, wood, grain, and beer is highly lucrative. The merchants grow immensely wealthy, and their influence increases accordingly. Hanseatic shipping is now driving the European economy. German merchants open a trading post in the Flemish city of Bruges in 1235. The Venice of the north, Bruges is the hub of the Hanseatic League and will grow to become the wealthiest and most powerful Hanseatic city. The traveling merchants from Germany established growing numbers of local trading posts in places like Bergen in Norway, where the fish trade is thriving. These entrepôts provide the German traders with safe quarters in foreign countries, and by the High Middle Ages, the Hanseatic League is a brand worth protecting, with a reputation for reliability and fair dealing. That's not to say that these early European traders didn't have a keen nose for business. They expanded their trade routes all the way to Russia. Even today, you can feel the spirit of the Hanseatic League in cities such as Tallinn in Estonia, formerly known as Reval. The Hanseatic League is an early form of the European Union. Trade routes are increasingly tight-knit, and a new system of logistics is developing in Northern Europe. The League maintains ties outside of its member countries as well, including with the Republic of Venice, which becomes a vital hub. In fact, the flourishing trade and resulting prosperity allows the Venetians to expand their fleet. They dominate trade throughout the entire Mediterranean region with their hundreds of ships. The Venetians' share of influence extends from the east coast of the Adriatic Sea to Constantinople, Syria, and Lebanon, and across the Black Sea all the way to Asia. But that's not enough for the Europeans. They want to go even further. Europeans become engrossed in speculations about the world beyond the world they know. They know that the Earth is round, but they have no idea of what lies beyond the horizon. Why did the Renaissance become an era of European world exploration? Was it intellectual curiosity, or the competitive ambition of powerful states determined to deny each other the advantages of new possessions? The Spaniards and the Portuguese were the first. The Dutch, the British, and the French followed hard on their heels. Whatever drove them to make these perilous journeys, one thing is clear: the world would never be the same again. The race is on to find an ocean route to India. Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus is working on a plan. He offers it to the Portuguese, but they dismiss him as a madman. He carefully studies the Book of the Marvels of the World by Marco Polo, in which the Italian explorer details his adventurous journey to Asia. The book is a bestseller in Europe and feeds a desire to know unknown worlds. Perhaps Columbus can convince the Spanish to fund his plan. But that's no easy task. He spends more than 5 years begging Queen Isabella of Spain. The native peoples, on the other hand, are baffled. They had never seen white men before. Things would ultimately end badly for them, but the first encounters remain peaceful. While the natives innocently marvel at the new arrivals, Columbus and his men already have very clear goals in mind. Two worlds collide here. The islanders have no concept of ownership. They believe the land belongs to everyone. The Europeans, on the other hand, want to annex territory, convert people to Christianity, and exploit both the land and its inhabitants. This is where the fatal race for resources begins. Columbus calls the natives Indians. He is thoroughly convinced that he is in India. He finds the people to be friendly and not at all dangerous. He believes they would make excellent slaves. But he has actually landed on the Bahamas in the Caribbean. And although he doesn't find any gold, he is standing on the threshold of an unknown continent. The Baheim Erdapfel, the oldest globe still in existence today, was created in the very year Columbus sailed to the west. All the geographical information Europeans were aware of at that time is included on this globe, but its precision naturally varies from continent to continent. The Atlantic extends all the way from Europe to Asia. Both continents are a bit too big, and there's nothing in between them. Or is there something? A terra incognita. But why did all of this originate from Europe and not from what was then an already powerful and technologically advanced China? When the third emperor of the Ming dynasty ascended the throne in 1402, he sent out a gigantic fleet to sail to Africa and Arabia. But when he died, the new emperor received a memorandum from his advisors. They wrote, "Your servants hope that your majesty will not permit warlike plans and the gaining of glory by expeditions to distant lands. Give your people a period of rest." Whereupon the new emperor promptly decreed that high seas navigation would henceforth be punishable by death. The Chinese leadership simply had little interest in the outside world. China sufficed unto itself. Moreover, they had only one ruler. Power was focused in one place. There was no competition, not at least in the world of power politics. In Europe, almost as big as China, everything was different. It was shared among many sovereign territories with just as many rulers, and they kept goading each other on, even as they set their sights beyond the margins of the continent. Discoveries and conquests became weapons in a continental power struggle. To prevail in this struggle, you had to be open to new ideas and always ready for the big move. Hordes of armed men follow Columbus to the New World. They have nothing to lose in Spain, and they hope to find a better future across the ocean. They board ships heading west, and along with their horses, they advance deep into Central America. This land must harbor incredible treasures, they think. Legends like El Dorado, a Central American ruler so rich that he supposedly covers himself in gold dust every morning and washes it off every evening in a sacred lake, only serve to increase their thirst for adventure. But where is El Dorado, and where are his piles of gold and silver? The conquest of the New World offers immense opportunities to the restless, underemployed men of the Iberian Peninsula. As conquistadores, they strike deep inroads into the Americas, driven by greed, missionary zeal, and the desire for status. The main competitors of the Spanish are the Portuguese, an experienced seafaring nation. They too have an insatiable desire to explore the world in search of opportunities that will give them an advantage over their rivals. 5 years after the discovery of America, explorers Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeu Diaz set off for India. They round the dreaded Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and become the first Europeans to actually make it to India via this route. There's an astonishing dynamism to this process of European expansion. Competition with the Spanish crown drives the Portuguese to keep extending the range of their operations, and the extraordinary success of this small European country suggests that they must be doing something right. It was with these ships, caravels, that the Portuguese first reached Africa, India, Brazil, and Japan. Without such craft and their later and larger follow-up versions, the Europeans wouldn't have discovered anything, let alone conquered it. And what lay behind them was nothing less than cutting-edge technology. The caravel was the space shuttle of its era. Very fast, extremely stable, storm-resistant, and able to navigate in shallow coastal waters. Incidentally, there are virtually no written records of how this breakthrough invention was achieved. It was all kept secret. The shipbuilders passed their knowledge from generation to generation by word of mouth. After all, the competition was always watching. European audiences are enthralled by the explorers' travel journals and by the stories of their adventures. which describe breathtaking landscapes with lavish natural wonders around every corner. A life of prosperity and abundance seems possible there. The natives must surely be doing well for themselves if they can afford the kind of spices only possessed by the wealthiest Europeans. In the race for conquest outside of Europe, Spain and Portugal remain bitter competitors. Now the Pope plans to step in to arbitrate the conflict. In 1494, a treaty is negotiated in Spain to regulate each country's holdings. Using a simple method, the world is divided into two halves.
You servant, take this cord and stretch it across the map. Right down the middle. Like this. That's how we'll divide the world.
No, that won't do. You, move more to the right. Further, further, and you, the other. Further to the left. Good. That's how the border should be. Here is my part, and...
No! No way!
The Treaty of Tordesillas is intended to establish a definitive peace between the two rivals. America, to the west of this randomly fixed line, is promised to the Spanish kings, while all the territory to the east, meaning Africa and Asia, goes to the Portuguese. The treaty doesn't even consider the other maritime powers such as England and Holland. The conflict over global wealth now begins in earnest, and the competition among the European powers grows even fiercer. Everything changed. Europe's view of the world, its prosperity, its greed for more and more. The violence of this conflicted continent was projected outwards onto other peoples with horrific consequences. The explorers were followed by the conquerors. They set out into a strange and unfamiliar world, lured by legendary treasures and adventure. Mexico is a good example. Hernán Cortés brings an army with him right from the start. The conquerors view this new territory as their property, as though no one lives here. But of course, there are already people and cultures inhabiting these territories. This is Europe's original sin. By the time the Europeans arrive, Mexico is the center of a highly advanced civilization, but the conquerors are unimpressed. Their goal is to strip the country's assets and Christianize the population. We used to admire these fearless adventurers. We had forgotten what misery they inflicted on so much of humanity. Gold is abundantly available on this continent. It's a highly visible feature of indigenous culture, and the Mexicans who use and display it have no idea of the lust this treasure excites in the European invaders. The war against the native peoples begins. It's arrows versus firearms. Entire peoples are enslaved, killed off, or perish from disease and malnutrition. Their culture is destroyed, their treasures are carted off to Europe. What's more, the Europeans pit the continent's various ethnic groups against each other. The Aztec temple in modern-day Mexico City is leveled. On its foundations, the Spaniards construct a Christian cathedral. Europeans destroy a powerful empire and build their own on its ruins. It was a potent mix. In South America, Western European imperialism blended with religious zeal, and so the new lords set the stamp of their authority on the lands and people they captured. Many of the cities on the conquered continent still bear the signs of it today. Their models were palatial monasteries, such as the Mosteiro dos Hieronymus, or Hieronymus Monastery in Lisbon. Imagine the effect of such prideful, elaborately decorated facades on the indigenous peoples. The Europeans profit not only from the continent's gold and silver, but also from the natives' agricultural and medical knowledge. In today's globalized world, it's virtually impossible to imagine how deep the impact of these encounters was. There's profound change on both sides of the Atlantic. Foods that had never been seen in Europe before revolutionized the European diet. Corn, tobacco, cotton, potatoes, coffee, and chocolate made their way into Europeans' shopping baskets. After the introduction of the South American potato, Europeans finally have enough to eat. Soon the population explodes. You might even say that the American potato helped to lay the foundation for Europe's rise as a global power. It fed the masses. And in return, America gets grain crops, cabbage, wine grapes, and most importantly, domesticated European animals. The settlers now arriving in America bring pigs, cows, and horses. Life completely changes within just a few generations. The surviving native peoples gradually establish permanent settlements and acquire private property, just like the Europeans. America's prairies become agrarian landscapes, a decisive turning point in the continent's ecology. But even a peaceful encounter can have terrible consequences. The conquerors bring more than just their religious faith to the New World, they also bring pathogens that spell doom for many native peoples. Historical records suggest that within a short time as many as 80% of the native population died of smallpox, plague, typhoid fever, and influenza. We can trace the story of this dark chapter, the colonial era, at the Sugar and Slavery Museum in London. I've come here to find out more. We're in the Docklands in the heart of London, and in the 18th century, this was where they traded in sugar. It's often demonized today, but in the 18th century, it was idolized. Sugar was at the center of European dreams of power and wealth. The desire for sweetness is deeply embedded in the genetic makeup of human beings. The demand for colonial sugar was insatiable. In the years between 1770 and 1775, sugar consumption in England rose eightfold. No other commodity, not even gold and silver, could match it for importance. No other commodity so drastically exemplifies the destructive impact of European consumption, and no other product is so closely intertwined with the exploitation of Central and South America and the degradation of the human beings who lived there. But exactly how did this system of exploitation operate? The Caribbean became the object of intense competition among the European colonial powers. Alongside Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England also became increasingly hungry for goods from the Caribbean. In the process, human beings themselves were degraded to the status of commodities. The more colonies the Europeans acquired, the more workers they needed. Networks of African traders provided the Europeans with slaves. These were shipped to North America and the Caribbean to be exploited on sugar plantations. Ships transported the products of the slave system to an insatiable England, and the next slave raid in Africa followed soon after. This triangular trade became the most lucrative branch of maritime commerce, until, in 1807, a law put an end to the slave trade in England. The Europeans' contempt for the black population is a decisive factor here. They're treated as goods, not as people with rights, and the slave trade is shockingly lucrative. In collusion with tribal chiefs and Arab slave traders, the Europeans capture the natives and transport them to harbor towns where they're shipped to the colonies in slave galleys in abhorrent conditions. The atrocity of slavery would make Europe rich and powerful. This continent's ascendancy was secured at an immense cost in human suffering. There are registers in which the slaves were listed as if they were cattle. On this list here we see on the left-hand side the names of each of the slaves, then their ages, here the price that was paid for them, and on the right hand remarks on each individual that he is sickly, that he is a good Negro, a good hand, that he is a runaway, that he is slightly consumptive. Human beings are treated as commodities. There are approximately 40,000 slave transports from Africa to America. 12 million people are shipped on slave galleys, but only around 10 million of them are still alive when they arrive. They are processed through the slave markets and spend the rest of their lives on sugar plantations, cotton fields, or in the mines of South America. The goods produced in the New World are then sent back to Europe, a profitable cycle for white Europeans. Spain and Portugal proudly show off their new wealth. Cities like Seville and Lisbon grow into radiant, bustling metropolises, sparking envy among their neighbours. Europe is dominated by relentless competition for profit and power. Other countries shoulder their way into the global marketplace. The Dutch are particularly active here as merchants and as pirates. With its powerful fleet and modern financial system, this tiny republic keeps its European neighbours on edge. The merchants' impressive homes still bear witness to that golden era in the Netherlands' history. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange is established in the early 17th century. It's a meeting spot for people who want to invest their money in securities, as well as for those who hope to turn their securities into money. In that sense, this stock market is an early form of exchange or trading floor. And, like today's stock markets, this one had its bubbles and busts. This was the era of the tulip craze. These beautiful flowers had become a valuable commodity hotly traded on the stock exchange, even while the tulip bulbs were still in the ground. In the winter of 1636, the tulip bubble burst. 99 bulbs were auctioned off for 90,000 guilders, about 900,000 euros in today's money. The buyers were speculating that prices would continue to rise and they would be able to resell the bulbs at a profit. But it was not to be. People suddenly lost interest in the overpriced flowers, and the speculators were left high and dry. The wealthy merchants invest in art, and the revenues from trade fuel the rise of the Dutch school, whose artists Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Frans Hals still adorn the museums, reminding us of the opulence and sophistication of the Dutch Golden Age. Without the profits from the slave trade, none of this would be here. For the Spanish and the Portuguese, converting the heathen to Christianity was still an important part of the motivational mix. But in the 17th century, Protestants, especially in the Netherlands, were quite literally at the helm. As seafarers and cartographers, they had plenty of experience, and now they founded the world's first multinational concerns, corporations with a global remit like the Dutch East India Company. By this means, they secured a monopoly on trade with Asia. At times, they had nearly 5,000 ships under sail. Hardly surprising, then, that the merchants of Amsterdam, as depicted by Rembrandt, became immensely wealthy and built these wonderful palaces. No one can deny that this European city has a harmonious beauty about it, but there's a dark side. The lion's share of this wealth was acquired through the exploitation of peoples and of the colonies where they lived. It's an unsettling legacy that's still with us today. The odd pediment above a front door in Amsterdam still tells the tale. Here, for example, this house belonged to the famous Admiral Cornelis Tromp. He was a 17th century seafaring hero and master of many slaves here in Amsterdam. And here's a little black boy that the admiral bought for perhaps a few guilders. The sense of a God-given superiority over other humans is breathtaking, and Europeans have not found it easy to look this part of their history in the eye. It was only a few years ago that the Dutch Queen officially acknowledged the suffering inflicted on 550,000 slaves in the name of the Crown. And this dark past is still alive in the present, even on the royal carriage. But in a Europe that prided itself on its civilization and Christian values, were no dissenting voices raised against this appalling injustice? Well, yes, there were. And one of these voices belonged to Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas, who in the 16th century took up the cause of the enslaved native Indians, though he only later acknowledged the rights of African slaves. It was always unjust to catch them, and it was tyranny to enslave them, he wrote. This was probably the first European commitment to universal human rights, but it was not enforced until 200 years later, and then only temporarily. England would soon overtake the Netherlands as the leading colonial power. London became the foremost hub and driver of globalization.
Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves.
It's a fantastically catchy song that still stirs the blood of patriots here in England. The ascendancy of modern Britain began with the victory over the Spanish Armada 450 years ago. With a modern naval fleet, Britain did indeed soon rule the waves, bankrolled by the raids led by legendary privateers like Sir Francis Drake. Elizabeth I was the self-confident queen who led her country out of the shadow of Spain and Portugal, allowing it to become a global player. In a famous portrait of the Queen, we see the victorious fleet and the sinking Armada, Elizabeth I as a goddess of war. And here in Westminster Abbey, she rests in peace, the Virgin Queen who devoted herself entirely to her country and opened the world to England. Over the centuries, Britain proves its mettle as a naval and colonial power. By 1913, the British Empire encompasses about a quarter of the world's population and about a quarter of its total land area. The British navigator, Captain James Cook, is in the Pacific to observe the transit of Venus, but he has an additional secret task: to search for new territories in the South Seas. There is already abundant evidence of another southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, my home country. On the 29th of April 1770, James Cook drops anchor off the coast of Australia. He had set sail from England towards the South Pacific a year earlier. Now Cook will be the first Englishman to set foot on Australian soil, a triumph for the ambitious explorer. He goes ashore at a place he will dub Botany Bay because the botanists who travel with him collect hundreds of plants here that no one in Europe has ever seen before. Cook claims the east coast of the country for the British Empire and names the region New South Wales. But the country Cook has discovered for England is not uninhabited. The Aborigines arrive on the continent more than 60,000 years before Cook. According to their mythology, they've been entrusted with the land by a higher power. They populate the country as hunters and gatherers. And now come the Europeans who seize the land and murder many of their people. There are many places in Australia where you can find the petroglyphs of the Aborigines. Some of this artwork is up to 20,000 years old. It's the spiritual architecture of the continent. The images communicate reflections on the natural environment, but there are also depictions of humans. The white invaders adopt a threatening, demanding attitude, and their weapons are painted blood red. But something else begins with Cook's arrival too: systematic research into the continent's flora and fauna. The sailors who undertook these epic journeys were always joined by a complement of scientists, astronomers, botanists, experimental gentlemen, as they were known here on the Endeavour. In the 18th century European world empires, science and power entered into an intimate relationship. Gathering knowledge about the world, extending it, structuring it, was essential to the wielding of imperial power. The Endeavour was a British ship, and its captain was a Yorkshireman from Whitby. But not everybody serving on this crew was British. The experimental gentlemen, the experts and scientists who joined this team for the journey of exploration to New Zealand and Australia included the Finnish botanist Hermann Spöring and his Swedish colleague Daniel Solander. And on a later journey with Cook, the great German natural scientist Georg Forster joined the crew. These journeys of discovery were a genuinely European phenomenon. At this point, no one is planning to colonize the country. It's not until 18 years later that the first British fleet lands with a very different purpose. Initially, Australia serves as a penitentiary for convicted criminals from England. Enormous prison colonies like Port Arthur on Tasmania are the result. It's believed to have been the worst jail in the entire British Empire. More than 12,000 prisoners endure hell on earth in this remote location. By the 19th century, the English have spread out to every corner of the world: America, Asia, India, Oceania, Australia. English is becoming the new global language alongside Spanish. But the British soon run into trouble with their increasingly wealthy and self-confident white settler colonies. In 1773, the conflict between the British motherland and the American colonists escalates in Boston. 13 colonies revolt, and their revolution eventually creates the United States of America. British subjects become American patriots, and the cause of the frustration in Boston is the exorbitant tax on British Indian tea. The furious Bostonians board the British ships and dump an entire shipment of tea into the harbor. It's the first step towards American independence. Even today, there are still regular reenactments of this event in Boston. What begins as a tax riot soon expands into a movement for independence. The motto of the British colonies in America is "Give me liberty or give me death." The Revolutionary War begins in 1775. Englishmen, Germans, and Frenchmen, supported by their respective indigenous allies, are engaged in the struggle for the future of a continent. Ultimately, the colonists win their freedom from their colonial rulers with a decisive victory at the Battle of Yorktown. The Declaration of Independence is followed by the adoption of the American Constitution. But like many constitutions, this one is not an entirely faithful mirror of reality. Notwithstanding the colony's dependence on slavery, it solemnly states that all men are created equal. For all these dissonances, the American Constitution was an important step towards the emergence of modern democracy, not just in America, but in the old world as well. Where there is liberty, there is my country. In the decades that followed, millions of emigrants would take this motto to heart and pack their bags. They leave Europe behind them. Whole villages emigrate together. They are fleeing poverty and hunger in search of a better life. Today we might call them economic refugees. They view America as the land of prosperity and self-determination. No other continent has exported as many people as Europe, even into the 20th century. Today, nearly 50 million Americans claim that they have German ancestors, and many others have French, British, Irish, Spanish, or Italian roots. In the 20th century, America becomes a safe haven for Europeans seeking a better life. It's impossible to imagine modern America without them. In the 19th century, the United Kingdom is the largest colonial power in history. But the other powers don't want to be left empty-handed, and there's still some land to be had. Who would win the battle for the spoils of imperial conquest? In the 19th century, the European colonial powers entered into a bitter competition, the scramble for Africa. Colonialism was a fetish. It had less to do with profits than with prestige and fantasies of power. To possess and develop colonies was considered a sign of modernity. And here too, everything revolved around competition, that crucial motor of European history, which in this form existed on no other continent. The British were at the height of their international power, and they forced their neighbors to the margins of world events. This fullness of power was personified in Queen Victoria, who was also Empress of India, and once said, "We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist." The British were now stronger than they ever would be again, but like all great powers, they were surrounded by rivals and enemies. They were not the only players contending for African prizes. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all of them wanted a piece of the great pie, a piece of Africa. The great powers meet in Berlin. A continent is divided up and portioned out. It's the Berlin West Africa Conference of 1884. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck has invited representatives to the capital of the German Empire in an effort to prevent a looming conflict between the African colonial powers. 14 countries are competing for the last remaining territories. Ultimately, it's the Belgian king who emerges as the big winner. He's promised the entire Congo Basin, rich in resources. 10 million people will later pay for this decision with their lives. Germany, too, joins the ranks of the colonial powers. The Europeans know little of Africa. They think of it as the dark continent. Africa has already been bled dry by the slave trade, and now the last unconquered territory, except for Ethiopia and Liberia, is divided up among the European powers. Arbitrary borders, systematic exploitation. Today's Africa is still grappling with the consequences. In many parts of Africa, the indigenous populations resist the colonial authorities. At the Battle of Waterberg in what is today known as Namibia, the Germans, led by the infamous Lothar von Torta, drive the Herero people into the desert. Torta calls it a race war. It becomes an exercise in mass extermination. In Africa, colonial authority is founded on an alliance between the gun and the Bible. Missionaries educate the native populations and convert them to Christianity. The Europeans propagate their own civilization, deeply convinced of its superiority. At the beginning of the 20th century, the arm of the European colonial powers reaches across nearly half the world. The Germans share islands like New Guinea with the Dutch, and Indochina, like wide swathes of Africa, is under French control. The European powers even view China as a sort of colony. They gain colonial footholds all along the Chinese coast: Hong Kong, Macau, Tsingtao. In 1876, Great Britain's Queen Victoria is proclaimed Empress of India. Her immense Indian territories, home to numerous ancient cultures, come to be seen as the crown jewel of the British Empire. No other continent had or would ever dominate such a huge portion of the world's peoples. We're still puzzling over the consequences. After the end of the Second World War, the European powers reluctantly give up their colonies. Europe withdraws to its heartland. But the legacy of European expansion casts a dark shadow. The two faces of Europe remain. Europeans discovered the world on the far side of the oceans for themselves, and they made their own kind of sense of the people and things they found there. From their perspective, it was a remarkable expansion of the horizons of knowledge, an extraordinary feat. On the other hand, the legacies of their conquests were scandalous. European civilization is the only one to have imposed itself on the rest of the world. And only very late in the day, after World War II, did Europe discover that it did have a conscience. So the history of Europe is made of contradictions. At the very moment when Pizarro and his conquistadors are exterminating the Inca, erasing their culture, and preparing to strip the Andes of their bullion, Michelangelo begins work on his fantastic painting, The Last Judgment, for the Sistine Chapel. The history of Europe has left deep scars as well as treasures.